Hello, everybody. This is Adam Serwer. I'm a reporter with Mother Jones, and I'm here with Daniel Foster of National Review.
Hey, Adam, how's it going?
Hey, how's it going? I have to give everybody a disclaimer real quick. I'm in a house with a lot of cats, so if there's a large orange object that comes into view that's a cat, and I'll try to move it out of the way as soon as possible. Anyway, Dan, how are you doing?
I'm pretty good. We should tell people also, this is the Saturday night version of Blogging Heads. I know we shouldn't admit when it's recorded so that we're, the illusion is that we're every minute up to the latest breaking news. But we, for a variety of reasons, we couldn't get this done at the office. So we're both sort of doing this in domestic settings. And
it's a very special Blogging Heads. That's what we'll call it.
Right. It's a very special Blogging Heads, and I don't want anyone to think that just because I'm wearing a New York Jets hoodie that I'm not going to go out tonight to some of the finest clubs in this case, northern New Jersey, because I am, I have not yet begun to party. But so today we're going to start with this thing that, who would have thunk it, has eaten up the coverage of the Republican primary this week, which is newfound frontrunner, maybe not long for this world as a frontrunner, Rick Perry's attempts to mandate vaccination for HPV, which is a almost exclusively sexually transmitted virus that in its own right is not so bad of a scene, but does really, really terrible things in terms of causing cancer in the reproductive organs in various ways that can leave women infertile and potentially worse than that. So he tried to mandate that all girls in Texas public schools entering 6th grade get this vaccine for HPV. And he tried to do it by executive order. And what happened in Texas was that the legislature said, no, you're not going to do that. They shut it down. And it didn't happen. And it's become an issue on the trail, I think, mainly because it's really hard to get to Perry's right on a lot of national issues, and because the Texas governorship is so constitutionally weak, people from Texas hate hearing that. I have found, talking to them, they hate hearing that it's a weak office. And it's certainly true that Perry has made it stronger through the bully pulpit and through his personality, and just the fact that he's been there for so long, everybody owes him a favor. But anyway, it's a constitutionally weak office. And so he doesn't have his fingerprints on a lot of major, there's no red meat sort of policy-wise to get to Perry's right. And this, I think, every shop and every advisor in all the other, campaigns are looking for battleground to hurt him.
It's this in immigration, pretty much.
Yeah, exactly. And we had an interesting report from our Bob Costa, a little blog post late yesterday or today, from some people inside the Ron Paul campaign. And, Paul's obviously not a front runner, but or a favorite for the nomination, but Paul's people are saying they're really ticked off, for instance, in how Bachmann, we can get into the specifics, but how Bachmann attacked the vaccination issue, because the Paul people, and I imagine every other campaign too, thinks that this was great stuff and that they could get a lot out of it for a long time if they approached it right. And Bachmann kind of came out and said, this vaccine is going to make your daughter mentally retarded. I mean, that's only a slight exaggeration of what she said. And so the Paul campaign was really annoyed that she kind of, instead of shearing the sheep many times, she skinned it. So it shows how little there is, I think, to try and get to Perry's right, on both because he happens to be very conservative, and his book Fed Up is very conservative, but also because he just doesn't have his hands on that much in terms of major policy things in Texas. But so there's a lot of interesting things to talk about here. I mean, I want to hear your take on the policy. I think that what Perry's vulnerable for is both the process is, mainly procedural stuff. I think I wouldn't be surprised if on the policy you and I are pretty close, but we should talk both about whether or not we should be mandating this sort of vaccination, and then we should talk about the politics around Perry's attempt to do so.
Yeah, I mean, I think when you start talking about communicable diseases, sexually transmitted or not, that cause cancer. I mean, like I'm not really sympathetic to the idea that it's a parent's right to help their kid get cancer. I mean, because they think that might stop them from having sex one day. It's just like not. And particularly with HPV, HPV isn't a disease that shows symptoms for a lot of people, particularly men. Like men, there's almost no way to know that you have it.
Right, yeah.
So you can go around giving it to people and have no idea. And you can have it and you have no idea. And it's just if you can get rid of it, something like that. Particularly a disease that you can't, that's like hard to figure out that you have it, and therefore hard to make sure that you're not transmitting it. I just think it's sort of, if you can get rid of something like that, you really should. And I think, what's interesting is a lot of lefties were praising Michael Gerson for this op-ed he wrote, where I think he mentioned a woman who had actually not, there's this idea that this is going to stop people from having premarital sex, but he sort of told the story of this woman who had not had premarital sex, and she had married her husband as a virgin, and he had HPV, and he gave it to her, and she got cervical cancer. And obviously it's like, I mean, the point of this anecdote is you do everything right and you still get screwed anecdote.
Yeah.
But the problem with that anecdote is that it applies to maybe like 5% of the population, because literally about 95% of Americans have premarital sex. So like this idea that the HPV vaccine, giving your kid the HPV vaccine is going to stop them from having premarital sex is just, really poor reasoning. Like, and particularly because teenagers are, in general, the kind of people who discount future risks. That's why they're teenagers. They don't think ahead. It's just I don't know. I mean, I think on the sort of policy of if you had an effective HPV vaccine, should you mandate? I think the answer is the same for all other serious diseases. But I think. And I think you're probably going to go into this. I think what's different, though, is how Perry ended up trying to mandate it, which I think is actually worthy of criticism.
Yeah, I mean, I actually I don't think there's a bright white line in terms of whether or not these things are right and proper to mandate, and how strong the mandate should be, opt-in versus opt-out and stuff like that. I think this is a classic case where, I mean, in my mind, preventing the spread of infectious diseases, especially ones that can be life-altering, in some cases life-threatening, like this, are the sort of thing that it makes sense for government to do, particularly local government, because I think, these sorts of mandates should take local factors into account. So I don't have any real problem with that. The tactic, the criticism that Michelle Bachmann flirted with, and, did more than flirt with, but and that we called her on, at least at NRO, is this kind of fringe vaccinations per se are risky and dangerous and evil sort of talk. It's been called Jenny McCarthyism because she's the prominent celebrity proponent of it. I happen to think that this, I mean, and it's a handful of celebrities who are like the most vocal people on this. To me, this is a special case of the left's very own version of anti-science, which is what I see in, it's not necessarily anti-science, it's certainly anti-technology or anti-sort of advancement or anti-artificiality.
I think it's anti-science. I mean, the science is, there's no hard scientific evidence of their point. So, to put forth an argument that doesn't have any scientific basis for it is pretty anti-science, I think.
Yeah, no, I agree. But I mean, the broader phenomenon I'm talking about is I think that the anti-vaccination stuff is a species of the genus that's I only eat raw food, macrobiotic,
organic. It's artificial, therefore it's artificial, therefore
it's evil. Yeah, this sort of back to earthism that. And in like lifestyle choices, I make probably some of the same lifestyle choices those people do, but it's part and parcel of I do think the left's version of anti-science. But anyway, that, then that's an interesting conversation in its own right. But There are some vaccines that are genuinely risky. I mean, there's controversy about the sorts of vaccines we were going to make soldiers take, post 9/11, because some of these things are nasty little buggers, and they're
right, like anthrax. Anthrax is a bit of a risky vaccine, but
right. That was. But
we're not mandating anthrax for you have to get an anthrax. You get an anthrax vaccine if you're a Marine because you're going to like a country, and there's like a possibility that somebody might use a biological weapon, and anthrax is a very common and easy one to use. But you don't have to get vaccinated for anthrax to go to kindergarten in Washington D.C.
Exactly.
Or something.
So I mean, there are vaccines that carry small chances for infection, and there are vaccines that are fatal, but there's just that can be fatal in very, very, very rare cases. But we had Dr. Henry Miller, I think, who's a FDA guy for 15 or 20 years, and now is at Hoover Institution, come in and do a guest post for us, and just sort of said, look, not only is this vaccine not going to kill your daughter or make her mentally retarded, it's as far as FDA trials go, one of the most widely effective, low side effect vaccines they've ever tested. I mean, it's just it's pretty cut and dry, at least in terms of the FDA trials, that as far as we know now, there's no real risk about that sort of thing. So from both a public policy point of view, is this the sort of thing governments? I think school districts are the way to do it. I think that's the locus where you want to write these sorts of mandates. But is this the sort of thing that the government should be doing? I have no problem with that. Is the anti-vaccination line compelling or convincing? Not at all. But there is this other angle that you brought up, and
the
this
Merck
one I
angle.
think is. The Merck angle. We should talk about that in a minute. But no, I mean the parental rights stuff.
Right.
And specifically as it's related to. It's the same kind of argument brought up against compulsory sex ed, is that why should we be, as it were, admitting defeat that this is necessary because our sons and daughters will engage in risky sexual activity, and that sort of mindset that animates it. In this case, I don't think it's intuitively, plausible. I agree with you that it's just hard for me to game out a scenario where I'm a father and I think that the risk of encouraging my daughter to engage in more risky sexual behavior outweighs the benefit of, preventing this highly preventable and really, sort of tragic outcome that is. And, a lot of people have anecdotes. I happen to know somebody who cannot have children because of HPV specifically. So I mean, everyone's some people have anecdotes, some people don't. But in any event, this is certainly a bad outcome, and I just can't imagine a scenario in which I think as a parent that's the way the cost benefit shakes out. But you know what? I also take parental rights and the importance of local, in this case super local, down to the family, like knowledge seriously. And I think that the opt-out is a perfectly reasonable thing to do. And if you're a parent, and you have conscientious reasons for not wanting your daughter to be inoculated, I don't have a problem with that either. And like I said, personally, I wouldn't do it. And I think an interesting thought experiment on this subject is: would we really be talking about increasing the risk of premarital sex and things like that if this were an AIDS vaccine? I mean, imagine if this were something that's burned into our consciousness as this super deadly.
I think we would. Yeah. And that's that. I mean, I actually said this to Connor Friedersdorf on a different Blogging Heads. Is that a lot of the people? I do think someone like Michelle Bachmann would be saying, they'd be saying, don't mandate the AIDS vaccine because then people will engage in more risky sexual behavior. And I find that it sort of blows my mind, but I think that's what would happen.
Oh, really? I don't know. I'm sure don't get me wrong, I'm sure there would be some people who would come at it from that angle, but I just think that makes the trade-offs a lot more clear. And for a lot of reasons, partially, one reason is that the trade-offs in HIV are obviously different than the trade-offs in HPV. Although, like I said, it's pretty bad little bug if it's.
But like I think that. Well, there's a couple reasons why I think it would happen. I think it would happen in part because I think for the people who would be protesting this, I think the stigma of HIV as a disease that happens to certain kinds of people only is still pretty prevalent. But I also think that I mean again,
so they would be saying
that teenagers are bad at assessing risk in general. And I think they're just, when you're, I mean, think back, Dan, if you can, when you were a teenager and, and you were with, your girlfriend for the first time, you're just not thinking about like, am I going to get sick or something? You're just not, it's, I got a vaccine for something, so I'm okay. It's just not something you think about. You are completely fixated on, on the moment, which is, just extremely, like, I just don't think that there's any way that a teenager in that situation is going to stop themselves and think, oh, but I might get HPV, and I didn't get a vaccine and so I'm just not gonna do it. Or even if HIV is like obviously a much more scary, intimidating, kids know about it type of disease. But I think even in that case, you see like now where the disease is active and still rampant, teenagers still make dumb decisions about sex.
I mean, AIDS, like I said, it's not a perfect analogy. AIDS is different too because there's more than one real vector, for transmission. But it's still, primarily sexual transmission, especially these days. But I would quibble a little bit with what you were saying about teenagers I do think that we have been successful, and I use that term neutrally. I just think it's an empirical fact that we've been successful instilling in teenagers and in young people's minds, certainly my generation, just how if you have sex, you're probably going to die in a terrible way. I think that we've actually that sort of thinking has I think for good and for ill penetrated the average teenager's mind. So I wouldn't say that you're there, your first time with your girlfriend and
I think it depends on the teenager. I mean, I think most of the teenagers I knew, particularly the male teenagers that I knew, they were far more worried about like what their male peers might think of them if they didn't have sex than they were about the possibility of dying with AIDS if they did. I mean,
yeah, and I mean, and the statistics certainly don't paint a picture of a terrified populace that's won't even is scared to even make eye contact with some member of the opposite sex. But anyway, that was so I wouldn't go so far just to say anecdotally that it's just not in your mind. But I would say
I think we're more aware of the risks. I think that's probably right.
Yeah. So I mean, and I just like I said, I think in this case, it's probably fair to say that it's implausible in the aggregate at the macro level that mandating a vaccine like this will increase risky sexual behavior. I just don't think that's likely. But like I said, I'm not at every kitchen table in Texas, so.
But there is an opt-out. I mean, like, if you...
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
Perry had an opt-out. I mean, like, if this is, like, a deeply personal thing where you feel like you cannot, as a matter of faith, you can't do... I mean, like, there is an opt-out.
Right, and so that's why I think, as a matter of public policy, this it was fairly well designed. Now we can get into the process stuff, which is what we were alluding to before, which is that... Yeah, which is that he did it as an executive order. And that's something that kind of process-oriented conservatives have a problem with because, you'd rather do that stuff legislatively. And he also did it against the background of some financial support from Merck, directly and indirectly. So it's Merck's vaccine. It'll be their vaccine until their patent runs out, and they've been aggressively lobbying a lot of states to mandate this vaccine. It's also interesting to note, just observationally, I don't even know what to make of this or what I think of it, but it's interesting to note how unsuccessful Merck has been so far in trying to get and how unsuccessful the attempt has been so far to try and get states to mandate this. Our Kate Trinko did a little research and found out that 24, 25, don't quote me on that, it's somewhere around there, mid-20s states had introduced, at least into their legislatures, mandates for Gardasil. And the only two jurisdictions, I should say, that did it were Virginia and D.C. Mm-hmm. D.C. did it. There was some controversy when it was passed by the council. I wondered if it was a council thing or something that Congress could make them do. But when D.C. passed it to their council, there was a good deal of controversy. Virginia passed it in 2007, I think, and their House had recently passed legislation reversing the mandate, but it got held up in the Senate. So, in a country where they've been pretty, this has been pretty heavily lobbied, and half the states have introduced it. It's been remarkably unsuccessful policy.
Yeah.
Which makes Texas stand out even more, and suggests interesting questions about whether or not Perry did this as a favor to some friends, or whether at least that influenced his decision-making on this. And his quick 180, I think, on it suggests to me not only that he's because now what he's saying is, oh, I made a mistake, I made a process mistake, I should have gone to the legislature. And then when I think about it, the legislature was right, we shouldn't do this. And that's sort of been his new rhetoric. But I think that
he's back and forth, though. I mean, sometimes he offers pretty strong. And sometimes, it's been strange. He hasn't completely repudiated it, but right. He vacillates between defending it and conceding the point.
Yeah, and I think that's not just a measure of him trying to be opportunistic and having it both ways and thinking tactically about the race. I think it's also just a measure of the fact that he's not really committed. I mean, I think that's a true reflection, and I don't even mean that cynically, like, oh, he doesn't believe anything. I just mean this doesn't seem like it's the sort of thing that kept him up at night. It was just sort of, it was sort of business as usual in terms of.
I think I think what you're describing is the reason why the process stuff seems a little damaging, because if he had been really passionate about it, it would have been hard to suggest that he was doing this as a favor for a friend. But because it seems like he doesn't have incredibly strong feelings about it, it makes it seem more like a little quid pro quo.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think Perry, I looked at this a little. I think Perry is vulnerable on the crony capitalist stuff. And he's got a lot. One of the points made by conservative policy types to me in Texas when I talk to them about this is that, look, the guy's just been around so long that there have been so many deals that he's signed off on. So many, there's a couple of these kind of public-private funds, where you can get, subsidized loans from the state to open small businesses, yada, yada, yada. There's so many of these things that he's overseen in his capacity as governor that, you're going to be able to find some dirty ones or some ones that suggest that they're dirty. So I buy that. I also buy that, a lot of what he's done as governor has been with wholesale buy-in, not just from the rest of the party in the legislature, but from Democrats too. A lot of this stuff, like a lot of his appointments that people are going after him for. Are you appointed a big contributor to the UT Board of Regents? Well, those appointments all need 2/3, Senate approval, and there's, the Republicans don't hold 2/3 of the Senate. So there's plenty of opportunities where there's lots of buy-in from, the other party and from the other institutions in the state, that it's to a certain extent mitigates it. But certainly, without getting into that whole separate other conversation, he's vulnerable on crony capitalism stuff. And what's interesting about the Gardasil case is that this was a point that critics of Perry on the right have been dying to make for a month, and yet nobody really cared in the mainstream sense that it was a big story until it was about this social con issue. So I think that's pretty interesting. And
Can I bring something up that there's something that sort of has fascinated me from the beginning of this whole vaccine debate, but particularly because Michelle Bachmann has gotten such. I mean, the vaccine thing has been such a huge backlash on the right. And here's what I don't get about it. I don't understand how you can believe in vaccines and not believe in evolution. because the entire point of a vaccine is to stimulate, the sort of like immune response that, in the past has taken years and years and years to produce in humans. And like we get flu shots every year because flu viruses evolve so rapidly that you need a new vaccine. I mean, like the science of vaccines is like all wrapped up in evolution. And like I guess like you don't really have to know that to know about vaccines. I mean, like there were early civilizations that knew how to immunize people against diseases that didn't have the theory of evolution. But I just find it strange that anyone could think that, the Earth was 10,000 years old, but still be like, oh yeah, of course, vaccines. How could you question those? I mean, that's crazy.
Well, there's a lot of things that I want to say to that because I'm interested in this topic. I'm a compatibilist in the sense that I think that, and I think I don't see why it's a big. I'm a compatibilist in the sense that I think that belief in the basic truth of evolution is compatible with belief in a creator, I
don't think it's incompatible at all. You can still believe that God made everything and not question the science of evolution.
Yeah. Now young Earth creationism, that's not going to be compatible with. But I think that's a cartoonish view. I want to be careful there. I don't think that's a cartoonish view. I think you're entitled to whatever religious views you want. I think it's a cartoonish view of people who have, on the right, who have issues with evolution to say that they're all young Earth creationists. And let me say why. I think that on the right, the distrust for evolution, or at least the suspicion about it, is a function of a distrust for the sorts of thinking, and especially the sorts of public policy thinking that come out of that sort of worldview, like a human-centric, imminent, scientistic worldview. And the left used that. I mean, we can argue all day about like who owns social Darwinism, right? But that was a big, it was a big problem. It was a big problem for the way we thought about social problems and how they should be fixed. And
sure, but like eugenicism is like completely completely discredited as like a philosophy. Even like there are a lot of, back in the day it was an intellectual fad, and there were a lot of people a lot of fairly smart people who bought into it. Who now we look at them and we're like, you are a monster.
But I'm not just talking about eugenics. I mean, to this day, the evolutionary thinking and the focus on it has created a kind of naturalistic fallacy. The idea that just because something's natural, it's good. If something is seen as a product of evolution. I mean, let's go back to the last thing. Sexual desires, premarital sex, the reason people have sex. Well, we've got social, religious, political institutions that, for good and for ill, have things to say about when people should have sex and how we should think about them if they move out. So this worldview of reducing everything to sort of the way we were designed by selection brings its own set of political luggage and influences the way people think about these questions. So I think and I can see people saying, "Oh, you're giving opponents to evolution too much credit." And again, I have to be careful. I shouldn't say opponents of evolution. I mean people who think it's problematic, the emphasis that's placed on it. Too much credit. Well, they're not thinking in terms about.
I don't think that you're giving them too much credit. I just think that you're being a little selective about the way. I see what you're saying about the whole just because it's natural doesn't mean it's good, but to a certain extent, like both sides do that, right? I mean, like there's certainly a whole lot of natural quote unquote defenses of gender roles. You know what I mean?
Right.
Like it's like men are supposed to be like this and women are supposed to be like this, and that's natural. So like that's how we should do it. And of course, like when it comes to that, liberals will be
Larry Summers,
like,
right?
Well, we're not. we're not picking fleas off each other. We have a modern society, and there are certain things there's certain values that may not be natural, but we still need to uphold anyway. I mean, like everybody, people can make those sorts of arguments without questioning the actual science of evolution. Like, it's not, but this, I think it's perfectly. I think you're right that. Some people do make that extremely facile argument in the context, and people on the left and right do it depending on the context. But you don't have to. You can do that, and you can reject that, and still not think that evolution is something that's and still not think that creationism should be taught in public school alongside evolution.
Yeah, Bob, those are all separate issues to me. I mean, what should be taught where, and that to me is a separate issue. But my point is actually that if you interrogated people who are critical of evolution on the right, or if you interrogated that strain of thought, it's really not opposition to the idea that populations are more or less reproductively successful based on traits that they've adopted over time. It's not opposition to or suspicion of the mechanism of evolution, of microevolution, as they would call it. The idea that populations change over time as a result of exhibitable traits. That's not. I don't even. It doesn't ever get that far. I mean, I think evolutionary theory is a proxy, like I said, for a way of thinking about the world. And I would just to give another example of this. I think the same is true for climate skepticism. I mean, I've outed myself before as somebody who thinks the planet's probably getting warmer, but I think it's pretty. I think that the cognitive tools you need to think that the planet's getting warmer are really, really rudimentary in the sense that all it takes for you to believe that the planet's probably getting warmer is to understand the properties of carbon dioxide as a greenhouse gas, and to understand that it's measurable amounts of increased, right? So that's fairly. But global warming has become a proxy for a big debate about how we think about the world and what we ought to do, and on what scale, what sort of interventions we ought to make into, not just the national economy, but the global economy, what our priorities should be, and who will, and whether we should make, sort of environmental concerns trump economic concerns or developmental concerns for the undeveloped world that's, they're all sort of universally saying, well, you guys got 250 years of burning coal, and now you're saying we can't do it. But I don't think anybody, the people who are suspicious of that stuff aren't sitting around saying, we don't think carbon dioxide is an insulating gas. Now,
well, no, but my problem here is actually pretty much identical, which is that there's when it comes down to it, there's you can have this, just like you can have a debate about the ethics of what's natural and what's separate from. You can have a debate about ethics separate from whether something's natural or not. You can also have a debate about what to do about climate change, but you can't actually do that if one side doesn't accept the science behind climate change, and you can't actually if you dispute the basic science of evolution, and to the point where you're trying to get it taken out of public school, then that's a problem. That's where my problem is. My problem is not with the questioning of what the response needs to be, or with the world, the possible a political worldview that comes from being a hardcore Darwinist. It's just that we can't seem to agree on these basic things that have become politicized. And this is sort of my point with the vaccines, where it's nobody's to a certain for the most part, we're not disputing the need for vaccines. And as a result, nobody's questioning this. There are very few people questioning the science behind vaccines, and that's why Michelle Bachmann her remarks are so shocking. But my question is, why aren't we accepting the science behind all those other things? I mean, in particular evolution, because it's related to how vaccines work. But with global warming too, it's the same thing where it's like, instead of having the debate that you're talking about, we're having a meta debate about the facts first, which prevents us from doing anything about the problem. Period.
Right. Well, I would say, and I also want to differentiate. I think that I admitted that planet's probably getting warmer. I do think that the science there is in far less of a settled state, obviously, than it is in the field of microevolution. Although I actually do think there are interesting problems with evolution. It's kind of a pet interest of mine. But I mean, I basically agree with what you're saying. But here's where I would be Straussian and conspiratorial. I just think, I think that our politics is to such a great extent determined by this technocratic vision. The idea that you get a bunch of eggheads in a room with calculators and slide rulers, and they figure out what the problem is, and then they draw up a solution. They draw up a formula that constitutes the solution. So we've got this technocratic mindset, and in that sort of politics, who the things that
who has the most Brookings Papers wins?
Exactly, and the things that the public believes, right, determine policy outcomes in a way that I would say, frequently suboptimal, and a lot of people, on the right would agree with that. So, again, people always sort of think this is kind of a paranoid, like I said, conspiratorial view of things. But I think that the fights happen about the basic facts of the science because the way our politics works now, if everybody accepted the science, it would basically determine the outcome. So that's that's.
You see why that's problematic, though?
Well, because because
you see why that, like, if we're having an argument about the facts, but the facts don't actually change, but what changes is the response based on the facts, so you have to change the facts because otherwise the response would be fairly obvious. I think that's problematic, and I actually disagree with you that that's the case. I mean, if you look at cap and trade was originally a conservative response to if you go back to the early aughts and stuff, you'll find a lot of liberal people tearing down cap and trade, and now obviously cap and trade is the bane of the right. But the point is there are different policy solutions for these problems, and the human mind is endlessly creative, and I'm sure that conservatives could find a way to deal with climate change that they could live with if they wanted to, if the questioning the science wasn't the sort of dominant line of the party. But I just have a problem. I have a problem with Straussianism in general, but I have a problem with it in this particular case, as you've just expressed it, which is that if we accept the science, then we have to do X, so we can't accept the science.
Well, that's the way I see it. I mean, and I say that as much as a neutral observer as I do as somebody with skin in the game. That's the way I see it. Now, yeah, we can talk about whether that's a good way to organize the public discourse in a society, and I certainly take your points. But I don't want to yield the ground here either that both sides aren't capable of anti-scientism when it's convenient. I mean, I mentioned this version with Jenny McCarthy, but I had in mind another one when I was watching the Salinger hearings the other day, that the Democrats on the panel, you'd think from hearing their questions that the only thing standing between us and a bright future where the entire country is powered by a postage stamp size solar cell somewhere in New Mexico is big oil, right? And that betrays, and I mean, I've just done some looking into this, and I have, and I happen to have a friend who's a huge alternative energy public policy nerd, and we talking talked a lot about it, and I've looked into some of the numbers and some of the technology. I was calling around different high efficiency solar panel manufacturers, last week. I mean, it's just not true. I mean, solar's nowhere near where it needs to be a viable energy source for even a quarter of our energy consumption needs. So, but you wouldn't know that listening to elected Democrats. Now, this is a off-topic example, but my point is just that both sides are capable of this. Let's go with the facts that inform our preferred policy outcome here. Is it a problem that we're having the conversation backwards, which is essentially the way you put it? It probably is, and one thing that I do worry about is that there can be a kind of creeping of what's acceptable, or the Overton window, to use the jargon of the day, as a result of fighting, contesting this ground on the level of what are the facts. Because, as you said, there are solutions that were viewed favorably 20 years ago that now represent apostasy. And in these. Yeah.
Oh, sorry. I just want to. So I think you make a fair point, but I think what I would say to I don't think that I don't think that we're just a few months away from a solar powered utopia. But I do think that for all the buzz around the cylinder issue right now, and whether or not the White House acted appropriately, there is an incredible market distortion in the form of subsidies for the oil industry that I think does. I think the sort of free market argument here for solar power is that the government spends so much money subsidizing, and these subsidies dwarf what we're spending on solar. If it's subsidizing the oil industry, that creates a market distortion where private industry really isn't devoting the kind of resources that we would need to bring us to that, hypothetical solar powered paradise.
Right.
And that's my argument there. I didn't watch the cylinder hearing, so I'm not sure what the Democrats on the committee said. But that would be what I would say in terms of the oil industry's impact on alternative sources of power. I think that's a real problem.
Well, don't get me wrong. I mean, I think there is corporate capture, and there is regulatory capture. I mean, we'd probably disagree on the causes of that. I think that regulatory capture is inevitable when you regulate anything, right? So, I mean, because you just create incentives for businesses to put politicians in their pockets and spend a lot of money. So that's a real problem with the oil industry, and you're seeing the right recognize that, and you're seeing, whether it's ethanol subsidies or subsidies for oil companies. I mean, I happen to think, and I've written this, that, there are probably 100 good reasons to end ethanol and oil company subsidies, good policy reasons. I just don't think we should do it now. I mean, I don't think that this is the time to do it. But you're right, but I also think that the difference between the way we subsidize oil, and I can imagine your counter to this, but the difference between the way that we subsidize oil and the way that we subsidize alternative energy, especially under this president, is that we're not picking winners in oil. The government,
we're picking oil as a winner.
As the winner, that's your response.
We're picking an entire industry.
No, that's not true, though. The market picked oil as a winner 115 years ago, when it became technologically feasible to drill in large amounts, and when Henry Ford gave it its ultimate purpose, right? So that's who picked oil as a winner.
I think I may have lost
through a variety of good decisions and bad decisions, good public policy and cronyism. We have helped lock it in as our primary source of energy. But I think we would use. I think it's, to me, clear that we would use more oil and not less if it were less regulated. I think that's hard to argue.
Dan?
Yeah, my sorry, Adam, my Bluetooth headset just died, so I might have gone distant there for a couple minutes. Can you hear me now?
Oh, sorry, yeah, I can hear you now. Yeah. Sorry about that. I didn't mean to interrupt earlier.
No, that's okay. I just had to switch devices. This is my first time using one of those little annoying things that sticks out of your ear, one of those little microscopic Bluetooth devices, and it died on me. But but yeah, so I think it's pretty clear that we would use more oil, not less, if there weren't so much regulatory capture and so much sort of cronyism between the government and the oil industry. So yeah, I get what you're saying. Oh, we picked oil as the winner. Well, it might be the case that we're going to perpetuate its dominance in the energy market beyond its useful life, but we're not there yet. I mean, the alternatives to a world economy predicated on petroleum power are not good at this point. They're not good in 2011. So, I mean, I'm sort of in the position where I'll cross that bridge when we come to it. But in the Cylinder case, we have $750 million of loan guarantees to a company that was, a single company with a single concept and a single innovation. Basically, that they were going to spread the surface area out by putting these solar panels in a cylindrical shape, arrays. And you have, back and forth between the White House and this company saying, "Go get them, boys!" Sort of, we hope business continues to boom. And you also had Cylinder probably lying to the government. I mean, that's why the FBI's down there about their prospects, saying just a couple months ago, "Oh, things look great." So I think it's a whole different animal. In short, but we went off on this tangent because I think that this is an instance where lefties can be just as blind to science as righties. And I was starting to say that there is this kind of creep that happens if we're contesting the facts, then we become, I think, probably psychologically more averse to any proposed solution. So if we're contesting the facts because we don't like proposed solution A, now the fight is happening on the facts themselves. So we're not going to like any of the alternative proposed solutions either. I think that's a real problem, and I think that's the way I would abstract out what you said about cap and trade. Now, I don't like cap and trade. I don't think it's a good idea. I understand that it's motivated. The reason conservatives liked it, I think, is because they didn't think hard enough about it. It sounded like it was free market oriented. It sounded like it was a kind of friendly third wave. Yeah.
I think it was free market. I watched a documentary from it was like from 2002 or 2003 that described cap and trade as a corporate scheme to make it so
right.
corporations could literally own the air.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like I get, like, this used to be an evil, like, from the lefty perspective, cap and trade was this evil corporate scheme, and now it's like, liberals would have been incredibly relieved if you had passed, if cap and trade had been able to pass the Senate in 2009, 2010. I mean, it's
Sorry, do you see that's an instance of the same thing? I think liberals just hadn't thought hard enough about it. I think that it was a novel approach. I mean, you're gonna put a price on emissions, right? But I think that both sides have sort of, said, well, this wasn't sort of what we thought was being advertised.
Right, but that's a policy argument. You know what I'm saying? It wasn't like liberals were like, hey, the planet isn't warming, and so we don't have to do anything. They didn't like that particular solution. And what I'm saying is, like, we used to be at that point. I mean, there was a point at which, there was an argument about the best way to address this problem, and now a growing number of people question whether it's a problem at all, which I think is very different.
Right. Yeah. This is the other edge of the sword that is being sort of willing to let. Edmund Burke, one of my political and philosophical heroes, has this thread throughout his work that, and it goes back to Plato. It's not just Burke, but the idea that it's okay, people don't have to be right on every little fact or judge every little situation correctly with the powers of their reason. It's okay, and frankly, it's as much as we can ever hope for that most of the people have the right prejudices. And he uses the word prejudice, Burke does anyway. And he uses it positively. So I mean, I'm with Burke there. I think, I know what I'm paid to think about this stuff, or to do what I call thinking about this stuff, and so are you, and so are you. So we have good reason to be spending our time getting into the policy weeds on it. But I'm sort of happy if most people, for whatever reason, come out with the right beliefs, at least what I think are the right beliefs on these things, in terms of climate change policy and evolution. But evolution's different because I think it's mostly politically irrelevant in terms of, what Rick Perry will ever do that turns on his view of speciation is beyond me. But anyway, this is the other edge of that sword. And I admit, there's another edge of that sword is that if you're happy with that, and sometimes you sort of, sometimes the consensus moves away. If I'm happy to have allies in prejudice, that's one thing. But you never know whether they're going to be your allies tomorrow because they're not. Because you're not thinking about these issues the same way. Mm. I kind of fumbled there at the end, but hopefully you understand what I'm trying to say.
I think I understand what you're saying. I think that's actually a pretty good place to end things.
Yes.
But once again, it's always a pleasure. Huh?
Yeah, it was a great pleasure. And instead of explaining why we didn't cover the other two topics we were supposed to cover, let's just both agree that there were no other two topics.
Yeah. What other two? I don't know what you're talking about, Dan. I don't know what you're saying. All right, man. Well, it was great talking to you as usual, and thanks to everybody for watching.
Likewise. Have a good Saturday night.
All right. Take care. You too.
Bye.